Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to install the Havoc Offroad 6-inch lift kit on this 2017 Ford F-150. Now before you get started, you need to know that there is going to be a little bit of cutting and grinding on this vehicle. So just make sure you read through your instructions and that you're comfortable with it. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay guys, so we got the truck on the lift with the wheels and tires off. And the first thing I'm going to do is remove the steering control module, which are these two plugs here. And what we need to do is push the red tab as far out as we can, and then push in on it, and it should pop out. And the same thing on the one above. So the next thing we're going to do is remove this splash shield. It's going to be two 13mm bolts. Alright guys, so the next thing that we're going to do is remove all of the bracketry that is holding our lines to the truck. And that's going to be an 8mm here and then two 10mm right here. I'm also going to remove the ABS line and the vacuum tube from the frame right here. And that's just to give us a little bit more slack as we take off the caliper and kind of move things around. Alright guys, so now we're going to take our brake caliper off, and that's going to be two 21mm here and here. And then when we take our caliper off, we're going to want to hang it up on the frame in a way that's not going to put any stress on our brake lines. Once your brake caliper's off, your rotor will just fall right off. So the next thing we're going to do is loosen our tie rod. That's going to be a 21mm. So when you're trying to knock your tie rod loose, you want to make sure that you're hitting only the knuckle. You don't want to damage your arm or damage the threads down here. Just make sure you're only hitting your knuckle. There we go. So the next thing that we're going to do is remove our sway bar link from our sway bar. That's going to be an 18mm. So if you see the rod starts spinning at all, you might just have to hold it, or you can use an 8mm. See, it's turning, so I'm going to use an 8mm at the top to hold the rod while I spin off the nut. Once you've done that on both sides, you can just push your sway bar out of the way. And you don't need to remove this from your lower control arm. That can stay on there. So now we're going to use a 15mm to remove the 4 nuts holding on our sway bar. That's 2 on the passenger side and 2 on the driver's side. And you can just set this aside. Now we're going to remove our hub dust cap, and I'm just going to use a pair of channel locks. And it should come off pretty easily. Now I'm going to use a 13mm to remove our axle shaft nut. So the next thing I want to do is remove my ABS line from the hub. And to do that, I'm actually going to remove this 8mm bolt at the top of the dust shield here. And that's just so I can access this 5mm Allen key head and pull out that ABS line. Now I'm going to remove the vacuum tube, and to do that I'm just going to use a flathead screwdriver and kind of just break the seal and just kind of lift up on it. And as I'm doing that, I'm pulling with my other hand, and it should just come off just like that. So now I'm going to use an 18mm to loosen the top 3 studs on the strut. We just want to loosen them at this time. We don't want to actually take them off completely. So now I'm going to use an 18mm to loosen the upper ball joint. So you see that there's still a little bit of pressure on that. So just like the tie rod, what we're going to do is use a hammer, hit it a couple times, and it should break that loose. On the lower ball joint, there's a 21mm nut, and we're just going to loosen that as well. Again, just make sure you leave a couple threads on there. So now that I have the upper and lower ball joints loosened, I can remove the tie rod completely. So now we're going to use an 18mm to remove the 2 nuts that's holding on the lower strut. Okay guys, so now I'm going to remove the nut for the upper ball joint. You want to make sure that you either have somebody underneath on the knuckle or that you're holding the knuckle when you take this off, because the upper control arm is going to kind of want to jump up and the knuckle is going to want to fall. Okay, so now we can remove the lower nut and remove the knuckle completely. Now I'm going to remove the lower control arm, and on the bolt side it's going to be a 21mm, and on the nut side is a 27. Now I'm going to remove the 3 nuts at the top of the strut and remove the strut. Now before you remove this, you want to make sure that you mark your passenger and your driver's side strut. So next we're going to remove the rear cross member. That's going to be a 15mm on the bolt head side and a 18mm on the nut side, and there's going to be 4 bolts that need to be removed. So now we're going to remove the 6 10mm bolts that are holding on the drive shaft. Okay, so now I'm going to disconnect the passenger side CV shaft, and that's just to help us when we do our next step, which is going to be taking out the differential. So I'm just going to take a rubber mallet. Okay guys, so now we're going to remove the differential. So you're going to want to make sure you have some kind of jack underneath of it supporting it. We have a transmission jack here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the 3 bolts first. So this bolt on the passenger side is an 18mm. And like I said, we're just going to loosen that up, but not actually remove it just yet. So this is our next bolt that we're going to loosen. This one is a 21mm. It's going to be located on the driver's side right behind the differential. And again, we're just going to loosen that. We're not actually going to remove it just yet. Okay, now to get to the other bolt on the driver's side, the front bolt, we're going to need an 18mm with a couple extensions, and we're actually going to have to go over the top of this cross member to reach it. And then again, we can just loosen that up a little bit. And this bolt is going to have a captured nut on it. So once we slide the differential over and actually remove that, we're going to want to make sure that we retain that captured nut, because that's going to have to be reinstalled when we put the differential back in. Okay, so now that we got all of our differential bolts loosened, we're going to try to push it over to the passenger side as much as we can. And that's just going to give us a little bit more room to remove each of these bolts. So it slid over a little bit. That's probably about all we're going to get. But now we can go ahead and remove all those bolts and actually slide the differential out. As you can see here, we're going to have to do a little bit of wiggling, a little bit of tilting on the differential to actually get it past this crossmember pocket, but as long as you have another person with you, it shouldn't be too difficult. Okay guys, so we just removed the front bolt from the driver's side of the differential, and this is the retaining nut that I was talking about. You just want to make sure that you, when you remove this bolt, that you find this and that you keep this so that you can reinstall that later. Okay guys, so now that we have our 3 bolts removed, we can now remove our differential, and I'm just going to drop it down slowly, and then we're going to kind of have to shimmy it to the passenger side a little bit, like I said, to get it past this cross member pocket. So we lowered it down. Now we're kind of hitting the pocket, so we're going to move it over slightly. You're gonna wanna just check all your clearances and make sure you're not hitting anything. All right guys, I just removed the breather tube from the top of the differential. You can't really get your hand up there until you start dropping it down, but make sure you remove that before you actually take it out. Most of the time as you're dropping it, it just kind of falls out freely. But now that we have the differential out, I can just go ahead and lower it. Again, make sure you have a couple guys with you to steady it. And it's out. Okay guys, so we are on the driver's side on the front face of the cross arm pocket. Now this is the pocket that we're gonna have to trim. And on the front face, we're gonna measure 5/8 of an inch from the inside of this oblong hole here. And we're just gonna make a mark right there. And it should be right about the same. It's gonna be about 2.5 to 2 3/4 inches on the top mark. And then we're just gonna draw a straight line. Now we're on the back side of the driver's side rear pocket, and we're going to measure 4.5 inches from the outside of the pocket in. We're going to measure 4.5, and we'll go ahead and make another 4.5 measurement. And then again, just going to line those up and give us our straight line. So now where our line comes up on the front face, we're just going to go ahead and draw a straight line across the top. And you're going to have to cut through this little support piece here. And then we're going to continue that line across. And then it's going to go down the pocket and connect with our line on the back face, which is right here. And that's just going to be a straight cut down. And those are our lines. So now we need to cut that out. So now we have our rear cross member loosely installed, and you can see that there's an extra hole right here for a bolt to go. So we need to mark that, and we need to drill this hole out to 5/8. All right, so we got our hole drilled out. And now we're just going to test fit our cross member back up there like we did when we were measuring. And we're just lining up to make sure everything fits. Looks like it's going to fit. So now we're going to go ahead and take this cross member back out, and then we're going to paint all of our exposed metal surfaces so that they don't rust. Okay guys, so next we're going to install our differential drop brackets. And you're going to have two identical ones. You can see that they're offset a little bit. The offset is going to be facing towards the front of the truck. So we need to install these on the differential as if, like I said, the offset again is going to be facing towards the front. And we're going to use our new 9/16 hardware with a washer. And we're going to run those bolts from front to rear with another washer and a nut. And we're just going to leave this hand tight for right now. Make sure you got a few threads on there. And then our other bracket is going to go, it's going to orientate the same way. And it's going to go on our driver's side front factory location. And again, we're going to use our 9/16 hardware and a washer. Feed from front to rear with a washer and a nut on the back side. All right, now we have our brackets on. We're gonna go ahead and jack our differential into position, and we're gonna use our factory hardware to install our brackets to the factory locations. So we have our differential high enough at this point where the passenger side I can rotate into position. Push my factory bolt through. Get a couple threads on it. All right, for the top front bolt on the driver's side, you're gonna need a couple people. You're gonna have to jack it up. You might have to move the jack around a little bit to get your bolt through there. But just make sure that you're holding that captured nut on the other end as you're threading that bolt through. All right guys, so once you have your rear cross member in place, we're gonna use our provided 18mm hardware, and we're gonna run that from the front to the rear. And then we're gonna use our provided washer on the front and a washer and a nut on the back. We're just gonna leave that loose for right now. So now that we have our rear cross member in, we can kind of check our alignment of the hole that we drilled to the differential and the rear cross member. And everything lines up pretty good, so we're gonna fit our provided 9/16 inch hardware through there. You might have to lift up a little bit on your cross member, but you're gonna use bolt, a washer, and then a washer and a nut on the back side. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is mount our differential support brace. You can see that you have horizontal slots up here and vertical slots on the bottom. The horizontal is going to match up with your differential drop bracket, and the vertical slots is going to match up with your rear cross member. So the first thing that we need to do is take the nut and washer off of our differential bolt. And this brace is going to slip right over that bolt, and then we can replace the washer and the nut. Your kit is going to come with a smaller bolt, and that's going to go through the hole right here with a washer and then a washer and a nut on the back side. And then you're going to have two more bolts that are going to come up through the bottom of the rear cross member, through the support brace with a washer and a nut. So now we're going to tighten down all of the hardware that's holding on our differential. We're going to tighten all those bolts down to 95 foot-pounds. So the next thing that we're going to do is attach our differential vent hose extension. Before we can do that, you need to remove this elbow that's going to be on your factory one. Ours came off when we were lowering the differential, so we didn't have to do that. But before you can install your new tube, you're going to have to remove this elbow. And then it's going to go right here into your factory location. So now we're going to install our front cross member, and you want to make sure that your offset is towards the front of the vehicle, and we're going to use our factory hardware, running our bolt from front to rear. And then we're just going to leave that loose for right now. So now we're going to reinstall our control arm. We're going to use our provided cam bolts and washers, And the rear one, you're going to run from rear to front, and the front cam bolt, you're going to run from front to rear. And you want to make sure that they're captured inside the brackets. So once you get your lower control arm in, you're going to repeat that on the other side. So at this time, we're going to install our differential skid plate, and it's going to run from your front cross member to your rear cross member. And we're going to use a supplied bolt and washer, and it's just going to thread right into your cross members. We're just going to leave that loose for right now. So now we're going to install our sway bar drop brackets, and they're going to install with the openings towards the middle of the vehicle, and this oblong hole here is going to fit right over the top of our rear crossmember bolt. So we're actually going to take that nut and washer off. Put our bracket on, and then put our washer and nut back on our rear crossmember bolt. And then we're going to use provided bolt with washer and go up through the bottom of the sway bar hole with a washer and a nut on top. And then the same thing on this side here. And then you're going to repeat this on your driver's side as well. Okay, so now we're going to use a 15mm to tighten down the hardware for our sway bar drop bracket. So with our sway bar drop brackets tightened down, we're going to go back and tighten down the 4 bolts holding on our rear and front cross member. So now we're going to reinstall our passenger side CV, and you just want to make sure that your splines are lined up, and you should just be able to push it on. Alright guys, so now we're going to attach our strut spacers to our struts. Your strut spacers are going to be identical, and they're only going to fit one way, and they're just going to fit right over the top, and they're going to provide you with some hardware. It should be 3 washers and 3 nuts for each side. And you're going to tighten these down to 40 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we're going to reinstall our strut. When you're doing this, make sure that you reinstall your passenger strut with your passenger side, your driver's strut with your driver's side. That's why we marked them when we took them off. You're going to use provided washer and nut. And we're just going to leave those loose for right now. Okay, so now I'm going to remove the 4 18mm bolts that are holding the hub to the knuckle. Okay, and now I'm going to remove the 3 8mm bolts that are holding on the vacuum hub. That can lift off the back, set that aside, can pull the hub off. Set that aside, and then I'm also going to use an 8mm to pull off the 3 bolts for the dust shield. Okay, so now that we have our new knuckle, we can go ahead and reassemble it. And so we're going to take our hub, and I'm going to put the ABS line towards the top, and I'm going to set my knuckle on top of it so that that ABS line stays at the top. And I'm going to reuse our factory bolts. Before I put them back in, I'm going to put some red Loctite on them. Thread those back through. I'm going to do that on all 4 bolts. And then I'm going to tighten these down to 148 foot-pounds. All right, now we can reinstall the vacuum hub assembly, also making sure that our connector for our tube is at the top of the knuckle. We're going to reinstall our 3 8mm bolts. Make sure when you're doing this that all of your teeth are matching up inside, and then go ahead and tighten those down. So now we can flip our knuckle back over and reinstall our dust shield. So now we're going to install our knuckle assembly onto the lower ball mount. I'm just going to use our factory nut and just lower it down, Colin. You can just let it go. Yeah. Just put that on there. Okay guys, so after you have your knuckle assembly on, this part's going to get a little tricky. You're definitely going to want to have another person with you. But as you raise up your knuckle assembly, you're going to want to put a little bit of pressure on your lower strut to get it back in the 2 holes, while at the same time you're also going to have to put your CV back through your knuckle. There we go. Now go ahead and put your nuts on your lower strut. Okay, and then you can push your knuckle up over your CV. Kind of line up the teeth there. All right, so once you get everything in place, you'll see some splines come through in the center. Just reinstall your nut. And then just kind of give it a good push, make sure everything is aligned properly in there. And then we'll go ahead and lift it up and put our upper ball joint on. So to get your lower upper ball mount in, somebody's gonna have to have a pry bar on the upper control arm while somebody's pushing from the bottom. That's it. Go ahead. All right guys, so now that we got the upper ball joint in, I'm going to remove the nut on the lower ball joint, and I'm actually going to insert a spacer, a provided spacer on the bottom. Now that that's in, we can go ahead and tighten down the upper and lower ball joints. All right guys, and we're going to tighten our upper ball joint to 85 foot-pounds. We're going to tighten our lower ball joint to 111 foot-pounds. And as you're tightening this, you want to make sure that you keep your spacer right in the middle of the knuckle. So now I'm going to use a 16mm and tighten down our top 3 strut mounts locations. You're going to tighten those down to 35 foot-pounds. So I'm going to use an 18mm, and I'm just going to snug up the 2 bolts for the strut mount lower location. I'm not going to tighten those down fully. We're going to do that with the full weight of the vehicle on, but I am just going to snug it up a little bit. Now I'm going to use a 13mm to tighten down the CV shaft nut. We're going to tighten that down to 20 foot-pounds. So I'm going to reinstall our dust cap. I'm just going to push that on with my fingers and just give it a little tap with a rubber mallet. All right, so now we're going to reinstall our tie rod. We're just going to use our factory nut. We're going to tighten that down to 111 foot-pounds. So now I want to reinstall the ABS line, and I'm going to remove the top bolt of the dust shield, which is just an 8mm, so I have a little bit of room to get behind there, and then I can fish my ABS line back there after I plug it in. Like that. And then I can use my factory Allen head bolt. We're going to go ahead and tighten that down. And then we can reinstall our 8mm bolt for our dust shield. Now we can reinstall our rotor. So now we can reinstall our brake caliper. We're just going to use our factory bolts. We're going to tighten those down to 148 foot-pounds. All right, so now I'm going to install our brake line bracket to the frame. I'm going to use our factory bolt to go right through there. And then we're going to attach that to our brake line like that. And then we're going to use our provided washer and nut on the end of that. All right guys, so now we're going to use a provided bolt and washer to attach our brake line bracket to our new knuckle. And then we're going to use the factory bolt to attach our ABS line to the knuckle. And now you can go ahead and tighten down all of the bolts that are holding down your brake line, your ABS line. Now we can plug our vacuum hose back in. You just want to make sure you push that all the way down to the bottom. So now we're going to install our drive shaft spacer. And you want to just make sure that you line the holes up, and then go ahead and put the drive shaft over it. And again, line your holes up. And then we're going to use our provided Allen head bolts with some red Loctite. You want to make sure you get those started as much as you can. So next thing we're going to do is install our sway bar. We're going to use our provided bolt washer through the sway bar, through the top, and a washer and a nut. Do that on both sides. And then do that on your driver's side as well. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten those down. So I'm going to use an impact just to run these up, and then I'm going to tighten them down to 45 foot-pounds. Now we're going to torque our sway bar hardware to 45 foot-pounds. Alright guys, so now we're going to reattach our sway bar to our lower control arm, and we're just going to use factory hardware, and we're going to tighten that down to 45 foot-pounds. Alright, so now we're going to go back and tighten up our skid plate. I'm going to use a impact just to snug them up, and then we're going to tighten them to 65 foot-pounds. And now we're going to tighten down our rear crossmember bolts that hold on our differential support plate to 95 foot-pounds. Okay guys, so now we're in the rear of the vehicle, and the first thing that we're going to do is take out this bracket that's holding in our parking brake cable. This is on the driver's side. And that's just going to be a 10mm bolt. We're just going to unclip that to give us a little bit more room as we're lifting up the rear end. So now we're on the driver's side still. We're up by the spare tire, and this brake line bracket, we're also going to have to remove this because we're actually going to add an extension later on for it. Okay guys, so next thing that we're going to do is take our shock off on the driver and passenger side. And I'm going to start at the top of the shock. Now I'm going to take the bottom part of the shock off, and that's going to be a 15mm on the head and an 18mm on the nut. So now we're going to remove the 4 nuts holding on our U-bolts. So at this time you're going to want to make sure that your jack is fully supported on the driver and passenger side. So now that we have our U-bolts off on the driver's side, we can go ahead and lower that side of the axle. You just want to make sure you keep an eye on all of your brake lines to make sure nothing's getting tight as you're lowering it down. And we've got, so we can remove our block, and then we're still going to have to lower it down a little bit more to put our new block in there. Alright guys, so now what you're going to want to do is get a couple of C-clamps and just tighten them on your leaf spring right on the opposite ends of the pins here, because we're actually going to remove these pins, and we got a new pin and little spacer that's going to go on this, as well as a new rear block. So once we have the clamp secure on both sides, we can go ahead and remove the center pins. That's going to be a 3/4. Now the kit is going to come with a top piece and a bottom piece for the leaf spring. The top piece is going to be angled up to hold in our U-bolts. And to tell which way it needs to go, you can see that you have 2 bolts close to one side and then a big gap on the other side. The gap is going to go towards the front of the vehicle. So that's the top piece. The bottom piece is going to have 2 different provisions. you're going to have a singular hole, and then you're going to kind of have a recessed hole. And that's for the two different bolts that are going to come in your kit. The recessed hole is going to go towards the rear of the vehicle. So it's going to sit on there like this. Alright guys, so once you get everything lined up, that should go in pretty smoothly. You might have to loosen up your C-clamps and kind of shimmy around the leaf springs a little bit, but it should fit in there pretty nicely once everything's lined up correctly. Alright, so I'm going to use a 19mm to tighten these down to 35 foot-pounds. Now with those tightened down, we can remove our C-clamps. Alright, so once you get it down low enough, you can get your block in there. Okay guys, now to align our center pin, we had to loosen the U-bolts on the passenger side. We just loosened them, we didn't take them all the way off, but it allowed us to get a little bit more play so that we could line that up. So once you do that, you can just jack it back up. Once you get your factory plate back on, you're going to use a washer and your provided nut. Okay, so once you get that on all 4 locations, you can go ahead and tighten this down. Alright, so we're going to use a 22mm to tighten these down. Now you're going to want to make sure that you tighten them kind of across from each other. So tighten this one, tighten this one, tighten this one, and then this one, so that it kind of tightens evenly. And you don't want to tighten it all at the same time. You want to just go a little bit at a time on each one. Alright guys, so now we need to put our shocks together. I'm using some heavy duty silicone spray. I'm just going to spray the inside of the shock and spray our bushing. And I'm kind of going to set it in there a little bit just like that and use a rubber mallet to knock it in there like that. And then the same thing on the back. Like that. Once you get those bushings in, your metal sleeves will just push in pretty easily. And you're going to do this on both shocks. Okay, so now we're going to install our rear shocks. We're just going to use our factory hardware. So to get the bottom portion of the rear shock in, you're probably going to have to press in on it. And then slide the bolt in that way. So when you're tightening your shocks down, you want to make sure that you tighten them just to the point where these bushings begin to swell, and that's where you want to stay. You don't want to go past that. Alright, so we're going to install our brake line relocation bracket with our factory bolt. The threaded bolt is just going to go right through that hole with a new washer and nut on the end. We're going to use an 11mm to tighten down the nut. Now we can reinstall our parking brake cable. Alright, now that we have the wheels and tires on and the truck's on the ground, you're going to want to make sure you plug back in your electronic steering stabilizing module so you can actually steer the truck. But after you've done that and you got it back on the ground, we're going to go ahead and tighten our U-bolts to 120 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and torque our lower struts down to 80 foot-pounds. And then next we're going to tighten our cammed lower control arm mounting bolts to 250 foot-pounds. Okay guys, well we just got the truck back from the alignment shop. Now after about 500 miles, you're going to want to make sure you go back underneath and make sure all your bolts are still torqued to spec. But that completes the installation. If you have any questions, give us a call or visit us online. Thanks.